Hi, Gary Pride again, going through Critical Pass Law School flashcards. Yesterday we quit in the criminal law section on card number 20. Today we're going to start off with involuntary manslaughter, card number 21. Involuntary manslaughter, a killing committed with criminal negligence or during the commission of an unlawful act not constituting felony murder. Criminal negligence. If a death is caused by a criminal negligence or gross recklessness, defendant may be liable for involuntary manslaughter. The example of that is the defendant is texting while driving and hits and kills a pedestrian at a crosswalk. Defendant's negligence may give rise to involuntary manslaughter. Commission of an unlawful act. A killing caused by an unlawful act not constituting felony murder may give rise to involuntary manslaughter. Misdemeanors. For a misdemeanor to give rise to involuntary manslaughter, the misdemeanor must be either malum in se, for example, an inherently wrongful act, or, if not malum in se, then, for example, malum prohibitum. The death must be foreseeable or natural consequence of the act. Felonies, any killing caused during the commission of a felony not giving rise to felony murder, will be at least involuntary manslaughter. So that's card number 21. Up next, larceny. Larceny, the taking and carrying away of another's tangible personal property without consent and with the intent to permanently dispossess the person of the property. The elements of this crime are, number one, taking, obtaining control or possession. If the defendant already has possession at the time of the taking, it is not larceny, but may give rise to embezzlement. Carrying away, the slightest movement will suffice. Without consent, against the victim's free will, the defendant's use of fraud or duress negates any consent by the victim. Note, this element distinguishes larceny from larceny by trick. Intent to permanently dispossess must exist during taking. Permanently equals for an unreasonable period of time. Specific intent crime is not larceny. If D takes property as security for a debt owed or believing it belongs to D. Continuing trespass. When one borrows property intending to return it but later keeps it, larceny arises at the moment the defendant decides not to return the property. Finding a lost item, larceny can arise if the true owner is known or ascertainable and the defendant decides to keep the lost property. Makes me think about lost wallets. Embezzlement. Fraudulent conversion of another's personal property by one in lawful possession. Elements. Fraudulent conversion of another's property. The defendant uses another's personal property beyond the scope of or inconsistent with defendant's possessory rights. Number two, by one in lawful possession. The defendant must have lawful possession at the time of conversion. For example, the defendant financial manager diverts V's funds, which D manages for V, to D's personal account. Distinguishing from larceny, the difference involves possession. Embezzlement equals conversion of property in defendant's rightful possession. Larceny equals taking property not in defendant's possession. Special issues refuting embezzlement. Intent to restore. If D takes a property intending to restore the exact same property, no embezzlement has occurred. Claim of right. Like larceny, embezzlement will not arise if the misappropriation is made under a claim of right to the property, if the defendant believes the property belongs to him. Here's an example of that. False pretenses and larceny by trick. Card number 24. False pretenses and larceny by trick are separate but conceptually similar crimes. False pretenses is obtaining the title to another's property using false statements of past or existing fact with intent to defraud. The elements of this crime: Obtaining the title, obtaining ownership, not mere possession, but title must pass from the victim to the defendant. 2, by false statements. It must be an intentional false statement. 3, of past or existing fact, misrepresentation regarding a future event is not sufficient. Intent to defraud. The victim must be deceived or act in reliance on the false statement in passing title to deed. This is the false pretenses. Larceny by trick. Obtaining possession of another's personal property using false statement of past or existing fact. Possession versus ownership are the distinguishing factor. Larceny by trick, the defendant acquires possession. False pretenses, the defendant acquires title. Receipt of stolen property. Receiving the possession and control of personal property known to have been illegally obtained with the intent to permanently deprive the owner of her interest in it. The elements: receipt of the possession and control. Physical possession not required. The defendant can have possession or control by designating the property's location or arranging to sell it for the original thief. Of stolen personal property, property must have been stolen while defendant receives it. Defendant must have known or have reason to know the property is stolen. With intent to permanently deprive the owner of his interest, A steals B's car and gives it to C to sell and split the profits. C sells B the car knowing that it had been stolen by A. C is guilty of the receipt of stolen property. Forgery, number 26, creating or altering a written document with purported legal significance to be false with the intent to defraud. Elements: creating or altering, for example, drafting, adding, or deleting from a document's contents, also includes offering a forged document as genuine even if the defendant did not create the forged document. A document with purported legal significance, a document that carries legal value, a check or a contract. To be false, modifying the document into something it is not, changing its legal significance, not just changing it to be inaccurate. With intent to defraud, specific intent crime. Note, actually defrauding somebody is not required. The mere intent to defraud is sufficient for forgery. Interesting. Robbery and extortion. Robbery and extortion are separate but similar crimes. Robbery is the wrongful taking of another's personal property from his person or presence by force or threat of injury with the intent to permanently deprive. Robbery equals assault or battery plus larceny. Force or threat of injury, a small force or threat suffice. A threat of injury must be to victim, a member of her family, or a person in their presence. The victim must give up the property because she feels threatened or harmed. Threats of future harm are insufficient. Larceny versus robbery. Robbery requires force or threats to obtain a victim's property, whereas larceny does not. A pickpocket commits larceny if the victim did not notice his act, but commits robbery if the victim notices. Extortion. Obtaining property through threats of future harm or exposing information. Extortion versus robbery. Extortion does not require taking from the victim's person or presence. Extortion involves threats of future harm rather than immediate harm. Burglary. A trespassing, breaking, and entering into a dwelling of a house of another at nighttime with the intent to commit a felony therein. I wonder about nighttime. It doesn't matter if it's during the day. Is it still burglary? I think so. Elements. Breaking. Can be actual or constructive. Actual is opening or enlarging or opening an unlocked door. Constructive is entry by threat, force, fraud, or duress. Must be trespassory. Entering with consent or through a wide open door is not breaking. Entering. Placing any portion of the body or the instrument used for the breaking inside the dwelling. Dwelling equals a structure used for sleeping, although modern statutes expand burglary to include non-dwelling structures. Of another, ownership is irrelevant, occupancy suffices. At nighttime, common law requirement, not required element under the modern statutes. That's what I thought. With the intent to commit felony therein, Modern statute includes misdemeanors. Felony need not be completed. Defendant must merely intend to commit a crime at the time of entering. Intent acquired after entering is insufficient. Intent acquired after entering is insufficient. Interesting. All right. And here's the biggie. This happened to me 3 weeks ago tonight. Arson. The malicious burning of the dwelling or house of another. Elements. Malicious with the intent or extreme recklessness. Burning requires some damage to the structure caused by fire. At common law, damage from smoke or water explosions is not sufficient. The dwelling house, the structure where someone lives, common law requirement. Most states now recognize arsons for any structure. Of another person's property, at common law, there can be no arson if you own the dwelling, but you do not reside there. Damage is required. Must be charring or something more, discoloration, blackening, or other lesser damage is insufficient. Yeah. Well, my house burned. Charring and everything. On fire. With me in it. All right. Insanity. Each state uses one of 4 tests to determine whether D should be entitled to avoid conviction due to mental illness. The defense of all crimes, regardless of intent, intent requirement. For insanity test, M. Naughton. Defendant doesn't know right from wrong. Due to a mental disease or defect at the time of the offense, defendant lacked the ability to know wrongfulness of his conduct or understand the nature and quality of his act. Irresistible impulse. Defendant acted due to irresistible impulse due to a mental illness. Defendant was unable to control his actions or conform his conduct to the law. The Model Penal Code, combination of McNaughton's and irresistible impulse. As a result of defendant's mental illness, mental disease, defendant lacked the capacity to appreciate the criminality of his conduct or conform his conduct to the requirements of the law. Durham, but for his mental illness, defendant would not have acted. Defendant's conduct was the product of a mental illness. Note, be sure to check with your professor as to which insanity test will apply on your exam. Infancy, diminished capacity, and intoxication. Infancy, diminished capacity, and intoxication are all defenses to criminal liability if established. Infancy, a defense to criminal liability for minors. States vary on the age cutoff, though many follow under 7 years old, not criminally liable. 7 to 14 years old, rebuttable presumption against criminal liability. Diminished capacity, a defense based on the defendant's mental defect, available if defendant can show that he has some mental defect short of insanity that prevented him from forming the mental state required for the crime. Not available in all jurisdictions. Intoxication, voluntary intoxication, defense to specific intent crimes. Intoxication prevents D from forming the requisite intent. Voluntary, the defendant chose to consume an intoxicant. Alcoholics and addicts are voluntarily intoxicated. Involuntary intoxication is a defense to all crimes. It arises when the defendant was given an intoxicant without her knowledge or forced to consume an intoxicant. Self-defense and defense of others. Self-defense may be used in response to immediate threats of unlawful force. Non-deadly force may be used if defendant is not at fault, not the initial aggressor, and reasonably believes it necessary to protect himself from imminent unlawful force. No duty to retreat. Note, force used should be proportionate to the harm faced. Deadly force may be used if defendant is not at fault, not the initial aggressor, and reasonably believes she is confronted with unlawful force that threatens imminent death or great bodily harm. No duty to retreat under the majority rule. Self-defense by an initial aggressor, available if either initial aggressor is effectively withdraws before the need for self-defense arises and communicates her desire to do so, or the victim of the initial aggression suddenly escalates a minor dispute into a deadly altercation. Defense of others. Same rules apply as for self-defense. The defendant can defend another if defendant reasonably believes the person he is protecting could have legally defended herself. Say that again. Same rules apply as for self-defense. Defendant can defend another if defendant reasonably believes the person he is protecting could have legally defended herself. Okay. Use of force to effectuate arrest and crime prevention. The following chart illustrates when deadly or non-deadly force may be used by police and citizens to effectuate an arrest or prevent a crime. Non-deadly force is permissible to reasonably effectuate an arrest. Police use force is to effectuate arrest. Deadly force is permissible to prevent the escape of a fleeing felon who possesses a threat of death or poses a threat of death or serious bodily harm. Citizens' use of force to escalate arrest. Non-deadly force is permissible if the crime was actually committed and there is reasonable belief that the person arrested was the perpetrator. Deadly force is permissible to prevent the escape of a person who actually committed the felony and threatens human life. Crime prevention. Non-deadly force is permissible to prevent a serious breach of the peace. Deadly force is permissible to terminate or prevent a dangerous felony involving a serious risk of human life. Defense of dwelling or other property. Defense of dwelling. Non-deadly force allowed to prevent or terminate an unlawful entry or attack on one's dwelling. Deadly force allowed if person reasonably believes force is necessary to prevent an attack on oneself or others by the person who made attempt or attempted a violent entry, or force is necessary to prevent entry by a person who intends to commit a felony in a dwelling. Defense of property and non-dwelling. Deadly force is not allowed. Non-deadly force may be used if reasonably necessary to defend against unlawful interference with possessions or trespass on property. The need to use force must reasonably appear imminent. Force is not permitted if a request that the perpetrator desist would be sufficient. Recovery of property. Force may not be used to regain property wrongfully taken unless one is in immediate pursuit of the wrongful taker. D steals A's purse. A can only use reasonable force to recover the purse if she is immediately pursuing D. Okay. Necessity, duress, and consent. Necessity, a valid defense if defendant's crime was reasonably necessary to avoid an imminent and greater injury to society. The objective test, defendant's subjective intent is irrelevant. Exceptions, necessity is not available if the crime committed results in another's death, or if the defendant caused the events giving rise to the necessity. Duress, a valid defense if defendant committed a crime under reasonable belief that doing so was necessary to prevent death or serious bodily harm to defendant or defendant's family member. Someone points a gun at D and threatens to kill him if he does not rob a bank. Exception, duress is not a defense to homicide crimes. Consent, a valid defense if the victim consents to the crime, arises most often with crimes requiring non-consent as an element. Rape. Consent must be given freely by the party capable of consenting. Consent is not valid defense for statutory rape because the victim is legally incapable of consenting. Entrapment. Entrapment is a valid defense to criminal liability if law enforcement agent has induced D to commit a crime. Elements. Criminal design originated with law enforcement. Criminal design, the idea or plan for the crime. D. The defendant was not otherwise predisposed to commit the crime. Defendant must have no predisposition to commit the crime. Law enforcement providing an opportunity to commit a crime is not by itself entrapment. If an undercover officer buys drugs from a drug dealer, this is not entrapment. The officer merely provided an opportunity for the defendant to commit the crime. A very narrow defense rarely effective because it is negated by a predisposition on defendant's part. Mistake of fact or law. Mistake of fact is a potential defense to most specific and general intent crimes, whereas mistake of law is almost never a valid defense. Mistake of fact. Mistake or ignorance as to fact will only be valid as a defense if it shows that D did not form the requisite intent element, mens rea, for the crime. D shoots V while hunting, thinking D was a deer. D did not form the requisite state of mind for the murder. Specific intent. Still going here, yeah. Specific intent. Any mistake of fact is a defense. Malice and general intent. Only reasonable mistake of fact is a defense. Strict liability, no intent, mistake of fact is never a defense. Mistake of law, almost never a defense. Lacking awareness or knowledge of an act that constitutes a crime, even if reasonable, is not a defense of that crime. And that looks like the last card. These are blank. Ah, wow. I got some beautiful cards here that are blank. Awesome. Well, thanks for joining me through that read. I know for myself, I'll be re-listening to these while I'm driving and can't read. Or some other place where I can just listen to things. So today was only 20 minutes, 21 minutes. A little faster. Yesterday was 28 minutes. I guess I embellished a little yesterday. So my name is Gary Pride. I'm just doing this reading of Critical Pass Law School flashcards so that I can try and memorize this information and get a real good grip on the law and try to understand it. It seems like in our society, we don't know all the rules and are kind of mysterious and kept in a secret place. So anyway, I'll sign off for now, and we'll be reading either torts or contracts next. Those are both first-year things according to the law school that I am looking at, and we'll go from there. If you want to subscribe or you want to do any of that, that'll be fun. I don't know if anybody out there wants that. I don't even know if what I'm doing here is not okay to read these flashcards and give my opinion of them for myself to listen to and others. So maybe I'll have to take these things down. I have no idea, but maybe we'll learn here. That's the whole point of studying the law. So until next time, take care. Thanks for watching, and be well.